I'm a student of study law. And you?
Back gathering here in a pretty great lineup of speakers, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody. I'm going to take my point of departure in resistance struggles in Pakistan. And I don't have a lot of time to speak, so I won't be able to get into a lot of details. But just so you roughly know, the sort of resistance struggles I'll have in the back of my mind is basically everything across the gambit, from livelihood struggles that I've been involved in myself. So for example, anti-eviction struggles against forcible evictions in many sort of an emerging number of slums around Pakistan. I think something that could be called anti-war, in the sense that me and the Awami Workers Party and Tanqeed, we've been sort of very vocal against military operations along the border of Afghanistan and Balochistan, and disappearances, torture, forced abduction, and so forth. And especially a lot of the counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency operations in military courts that have emerged, especially after the attack on the Peshawar school, where I think you all remember 100 children were killed. I think what you'll find when I'm speaking, especially about the kind of movements I'll be referring to, is when it comes to resistance politics in Pakistan, the centrality of resisting the military state, and actually the kind of contradictions that already exist, because as people on the left and as people engaged in, even if you're engaged in anti-eviction struggles, a lot of times what you're dealing with is a police backed up by military. So for example, our engagements with the Okara peasants movement in central Punjab had to do with forcible pushing off peasants off of military farms, and we were up against the military. So there is a kind of centrality of the Pakistani military state, and the Pakistani military state fits in a slightly odd way in the kind of geopolitics that you're speaking of. They're not on the Trump-Modi side, right? They're the ones they're the sort of the Muslim state that funds Islamist militancy and sort of needs to be hopefully wiped out in some way or another. And China supports them as well, which just makes the whole thing really complicated. And it makes it especially complicated for people involved in resistance struggles on the ground. So what I kind of want to, just the one message I want to try to get across in my talk is that there's always been a political paradox at the center of a lot of these movements. On the one hand, we're trying to resist damaging, at times violent, foreign policies, pressures, and influences, especially from the US after 9/11. And on the other hand, we're resisting an increasingly strong military state and far-right conservative forces. And a lot of times, these two fronts are resisted by two very different kinds of groups. So on the one hand, you have liberal Pakistanis, I think that's the best word you can use for them, human rights activists who do very, very important work in resisting militancy, Islamist militancy, and a lot of times also speaking out against the military state. But unfortunately, especially after the end of the Cold War, but also during the Cold War, sort of getting increasingly involved and funded by Western donors. And on the other hand, you have a huge Islamist movement that does incredibly effective sit-ins against drone attacks and outs the CIA director's name in Pakistan, right? But on the other hand, aren't vocal enough around issues of blasphemy or minority rights and so on and so forth. Now, what that kind of, the situation that we're standing in right now is, of course, like Amrit and Kavita also spoke about, is that Trump, we are seeing these closer links to Modi. We know something around maybe a Hindutva lobby internationally. We know the talk of strengthening of a defense partnership. And more importantly, we know that China is about to build the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And the Pakistani military state is intent on ensuring that CPEC is built. And they're so intent on it that they are not willing to listen to any critique of it. And in fact, just in the beginning of the year, a very good friend of mine, an editor in our magazine, along with a series of other people, was disappeared for 3 weeks. He had been incredibly vocal, both around Islamist militancy, but also around the military and the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So it's a very, very real threat. on activists and organizers on the ground. And what we find ourselves on the left over there in an incredibly difficult place. We're just kind of between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, you have this military state that also along the CPEC corridor, there are various kinds of abuses going on. So up north in Gilgit-Baltistan, we have a member of the Awami Workers Party currently in life-term imprisonment. He was accused of terrorism in the anti-terrorism court because he was trying to organize people displaced by a landslide up in Gilgit-Baltistan, and he was just a little too rowdy for the military state, so they've thrown him in prison. And if you move down the CPEC corridor and you come over to Balochistan, basically they're basically sweeping up the entire area around the corridor. And I've personally traveled around Balochistan and seen entire villages completely cleared of any people. So there are massive refugee flows and going in various directions out of Balochistan that isn't getting enough attention. Now you have that going on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have this sort of international arena, right? Where if right now I'm sort of in a room of people who are politically aligned, but if I really want to be vocal around my criticism of the military state and China, then the people first in line to give me a platform will be the Western far right, and it will be, Hindutva. And so you have a situation, so for example, if you look at Baloch ethno-nationalists who've actually done incredibly amazing work, political work on the ground in organizing women and students and so forth, and through study circles and political consciousness raising. On the other hand, you see their leaders sitting in Switzerland and in London and in the US, they're sitting down with members of the far right. That puts other members of the left and progressive forces in Pakistan in a very difficult position vis-a-vis the Baloch, because we don't really know what to do, because they end up actually really strengthening a lot of the Islamophobic discourse. So one of the things that they're really trying to push on is that ISIS is now entering Pakistan and America needs to intervene, or Modi needs to intervene. So very famously in Modi's 15th August speech, he mentions Balochistan. And you have the head of the BSO Azad saying that Modi is like her brother. But on the other hand, you also have her being incredibly important in the mobilization of women on the ground and in the political consciousness raising of a lot of young girls in Balochistan that I've met personally. So you have this kind of a situation happening in Pakistan. It kind of repeats itself in less serious ways in a lot of the other movements. Do I have a little bit? 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, good. So I'll wrap up. You have this repeating itself in various other ways. I think the feminist movements coming out of the Muslim world have been a victim to this in various points all the time. So you have this sort of, some people have called it a double bind of feminists in the Muslim world. We're trying to oppose both imperialism and patriarchy in our own countries, and the ones who are always ready to give us a platform are usually people that we don't find ourselves politically aligned with. And in some of the feminist organizing in Pakistan, the Feminist Collective, which is a very young collective of left progressive feminists that's just been formed in reaction to some of the misogynistic and slightly chauvinist tendencies of left parties, and also the feminist organizing within my own party and in other places have found themselves constantly approached by the World Bank, by USAID, by DFID, being told that you can come and we'll give you lots of money. And so we've been talking about a feminist politics of refusal. Like, what does it mean to refuse that kind of attempts to co-opt your agenda? And you see it also not just with the Baloch, but also with the Pashtuns, right? So the Pashtuns are given this kind of, the Pashtuns who primarily, especially the Pashtuns living in the tribal areas along Afghanistan, who are subject to the violence of the military, the violence of US drone attacks, and the violence of the Taliban, are basically kind of, they're given a false choice most of the time. They're told, wouldn't you prefer drone attacks to a military operation, or wouldn't you prefer drone attacks and military operations to the Taliban? And so they're like, they get forced into these decisions, and when they then choose, for example, when they say, well, actually we prefer drone attacks because they're more surgical, then they get platforms in the US and get flown over and become the native informant for various kinds of various kinds of agendas. So we're constantly dealing with this. And I think maybe, I know that this is an issue in a lot of South Asian countries. I think that in Pakistan, it's probably extra difficult because the geopolitical moment right now is one where Muslim countries and Islam, are on one side of this divide. And sort of the Islamophobic ones are on the other side. And also because, maybe partially because the left movements in Pakistan were decimated during the Cold War. And so what we then face, or what we have been facing, and this will be my last sentence, I promise, is that, the incredibly huge difficulty for us has been that the political terrain has been defined for us. And we're constantly forced into using the language that is given to us. So when Salman was picked up, right, the only we were also facing the choice of do we put pressure on the Pakistani government by using the discourse of secular activists have been picked up in an Islamic republic, right? We didn't do that, and he was released, right? But we were so afraid for his life. And those are the kind of decisions that we're constantly having to face. Because when we know when we say secular activists have been picked up in Pakistan, we know what happens in people's heads. And so we try to use that kind of political discourse and pressure very responsibly. And what we're really facing is how do we begin to redefine that political terrain on our own terms and begin to use a language that is more aligned with our own politics. Thank you.
I'm a student. I study law. And you?